The rain drummed against the massive windows of the Sterling mansion, creating rivers of water that distorted the view of the perfectly manicured gardens below. Alexander Sterling stood in his home office on the third floor, his sharp blue eyes scanning the quarterly reports that his assistant had delivered an hour ago. At 34, he had built an empire that most people could only dream of. Sterling Industries was a name that commanded respect in boardrooms around the world, and Alexander had earned every bit of that reputation through ruthless determination and an unwavering focus on success. The mansion around him was a testament to that success. 47 rooms spread across 3 floors, with marble imported from Italy, chandeliers from Austria, and artwork that museums would kill to display. Every corner of the house spoke of wealth and power, from the gold-plated fixtures in the bathrooms to the wine cellar that held bottles worth more than most people's annual salaries. Alexander had worked 18-hour days for over a decade to afford this life, and he wore his achievements like armor. But, tonight, something felt different. Perhaps it was the storm outside, or maybe it was the conversation he had earlier with his mother about finding a wife and settling down. At 62, Margaret Sterling still held considerable influence over her son, despite his protests that he was too busy building his empire to worry about such things. Marriage, in Alexander's mind, was just another business transaction that he had not yet found time to negotiate. As he reviewed the numbers on the page, a movement in the garden caught his eye. Through the rain-streaked window, he could make out a figure near the service entrance of the house. It was unusual for anyone to be outside during such a storm, especially at this hour. Alexander glanced at his watch and noted that it was past 11 in the evening. Most of the household staff had gone home hours ago, and those who lived on the property should have been in their quarters by now. Curious, Alexander moved closer to the window and peered down into the dimly lit area near the kitchen. The figure was small and hunched over, moving carefully through the shadows. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized it was someone going through the garbage bins that the kitchen staff had put out for collection the next morning. The person seemed to be searching for something, their movements deliberate despite the pouring rain. Alexander's first instinct was anger. Someone was trespassing on his property, going through his garbage like a common thief. He reached for his phone to call security, but something made him pause. The figure's movements were not those of a criminal looking for valuables to steal. Instead, there was a desperate quality to their actions that made him hesitate. He watched as the person pulled something from one of the bags and examined it carefully. Even from his position 3 floors above, Alexander could see that whatever they had found was being treated with great care. The figure looked around nervously before taking a small bite of what appeared to be food. The realization hit Alexander like a physical blow. This person was not stealing for profit, they were looking for food because they were hungry. The storm seemed to intensify as Alexander continued to watch. The figure was completely soaked, their clothes clinging to their small frame as they continued to search through the garbage. There was something deeply troubling about the scene unfolding below him. In all his years of building his empire, Alexander had become accustomed to the harsh realities of business, but this was different. This was personal, happening on his own property, and he found himself unable to look away. After several minutes of watching, Alexander made a decision that would later prove to be one of the most important of his life. Instead of calling security, he quietly left his office and made his way down the grand staircase that dominated the main foyer of the mansion. His footsteps were muffled by the thick Persian rugs that covered the marble floors, and he moved with purpose toward the kitchen area. The Sterling Mansion's kitchen was a marvel of modern technology combined with classic design. Professional-grade appliances lined the walls, and the center island was large enough to prepare meals for 50 people. It was here that his personal chef, Henri, created the elaborate meals that Alexander rarely had time to properly appreciate. Tonight, the kitchen was empty and dark, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerators and the sound of rain against the windows. Alexander made his way to the service entrance, a door that he had probably not used more than a handful of times in all the years he had lived in the house. It was the entrance that delivery people used, and where the staff came and went during their daily duties. As he approached the door, he could hear the sound of the rain more clearly, along with something else that made him stop in his tracks. It was the sound of quiet sobbing, barely audible above the storm. Someone was crying outside his door, and the sound was filled with such despair that Alexander felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. He was not a man given to emotional responses, having learned long ago that success required a certain level of detachment from the suffering of others. But this sound penetrated the walls he had built around his heart in a way that surprised him. Carefully, Alexander unlocked the service door and opened it just enough to peer outside. The small covered area near the entrance provided some shelter from the rain, but the wind was driving the water in at sharp angles. Huddled against the wall, partially hidden behind the garbage bins, was a young woman. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, and her simple clothes were completely soaked through. She held something in her hands, and Alexander could see that it was a piece of bread that had clearly come from one of the garbage bags. The woman had not noticed the door opening, and Alexander took a moment to study her face. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with delicate features that spoke of natural beauty despite the circumstances. Her skin was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had not been sleeping well. But it was the expression on her face that affected Alexander most deeply. It was a look of complete hopelessness, as if this moment represented the absolute bottom of whatever journey had brought her to his garbage bins. As he watched, the woman took another small bite of the bread, chewing slowly as if trying to make it last as long as possible. Tears continued to stream down her face, mixing with the rainwater that dripped from her hair. She seemed completely unaware of her surroundings, lost in whatever thoughts were causing her such obvious pain. Alexander found himself in an unprecedented situation. In the boardroom, he always knew exactly what to do, what to say, how to take control of any situation. But, standing here, watching this young woman eat garbage outside his home, he felt completely unprepared. Every instinct told him to retreat, to call someone else to handle the situation, to distance himself from whatever complicated circumstances had led to this moment. But something held him in place. Perhaps it was the vulnerability he saw in the woman's posture, or maybe it was the realization that for all his wealth and power, he had never truly seen desperation up close. Whatever the reason, Alexander found himself unable to turn away from what was unfolding before him. The woman suddenly looked up, perhaps sensing that she was being watched. Her eyes, which Alexander could now see were a deep brown, widened in shock and fear when she saw him standing in the doorway. She scrambled to her feet, nearly dropping the piece of bread in her haste, and took several steps backward into the rain. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I'm sorry. I'll leave right now. I didn't mean any harm." Alexander stepped forward, his expensive Italian leather shoes immediately becoming soaked as he moved beyond the covered area. "Wait," he called out, raising his hand in what he hoped was a calming gesture. "Don't run away." The woman stopped moving but remained poised to flee at the first sign of trouble. Up close, Alexander could see that she was even younger than he had initially thought, and the desperation in her eyes was more pronounced. She clutched the piece of bread to her chest as if it was the most precious thing in the world, which, Alexander realized with a start, it probably was to her at that moment. "What's your name?" Alexander asked, trying to keep his voice gentle despite having to raise it above the sound of the rain. The woman hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Maria," she said quietly. "Maria Santos." "Maria," Alexander repeated, testing the name. "What are you doing out here in this storm?" Maria's eyes darted around as if looking for an escape route, but the rain was falling too heavily for her to run very far without risking injury. I needed. She started, then stopped, apparently unable to find words to explain her situation. Alexander could see that she was shivering, whether from cold or fear he could not tell. Probably both. He made a decision that went against every lesson he had learned about maintaining professional distance. "Come inside," he said, stepping back toward the service entrance. "You're soaking wet, and it's cold out here." Maria shook her head immediately. "No, I can't. I shouldn't even be here. I'll just go." "Maria," Alexander said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in business meetings, but somehow gentler. "You're on my property, going through my garbage in the middle of a thunderstorm. The least you can do is give me an explanation for why." The young woman looked down at the ground, and Alexander could see that she was struggling with some internal debate. Finally, she looked up at him again, and he was surprised by the strength he saw in her eyes despite her obvious vulnerability. "I haven't eaten in 3 days," she said simply. "I lost my job last week, and I've been staying in my car, but it broke down yesterday. I spent my last money on gas trying to find work, and I just..." Her voice trailed off as fresh tears began to fall. Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. It was compassion, pure and simple, and it caught him completely off guard. Here was a young woman who had been reduced to eating garbage, standing in the rain outside his mansion, and all she was asking for was to be left alone to continue her desperate search for sustenance. "When you say you lost your job," Alexander said carefully, "what kind of work were you doing?" Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, though it did little good given the rain. "I was a maid at the Grand Plaza Hotel downtown. I worked there for 2 years, but they had to let people go because business was slow. I've been looking for another job, but..." She shrugged helplessly. Alexander knew the Grand Plaza Hotel. It was a respectable establishment, and if Maria had worked there for 2 years, she was likely a reliable employee who had simply been caught up in economic circumstances beyond her control. This was not a story of poor choices or character flaws. This was a story of bad luck and a system that offered little support for those who fell through the cracks. "Come inside," he said again, this time with more authority. "We need to get you dry and warm, and then we can figure out what to do from there." Maria hesitated again, but the combination of Alexander's tone and the increasing intensity of the storm seemed to convince her. She nodded slowly and followed him toward the service entrance, still clutching the piece of bread as if it might disappear at any moment. As they entered the kitchen, Alexander was struck by how different the space looked with Maria in it. The gleaming surfaces and high-end appliances seemed almost obscene in contrast to the young woman's obvious need. He grabbed a dish towel from one of the drawers and handed it to her. "This isn't going to be enough," he said, noting how thoroughly soaked her clothes were. "Wait here for a moment." Alexander left Maria standing in the kitchen and went to the laundry room adjacent to it. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, kept spare clothing there for emergencies, and he was able to find a clean sweatshirt and a pair of sweatpants that would be too large for Maria but would at least be dry and warm. He also grabbed a clean towel and returned to find Maria exactly where he had left her, dripping water onto the pristine kitchen floor. "There's a powder room just down that hall," he said, pointing toward a corridor that led to the staff quarters. "You can change into these dry clothes, and then we'll see about getting you some proper food." Maria looked at the clothes in his hands as if he was offering her $1 million. "I can't take these," she said. "You've already done too much." "Maria," Alexander said, and she looked up at him with those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold years of pain. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Tuesday." It was now Friday night. Alexander felt that strange tightness in his chest again, and he realized that his entire perspective on the evening had shifted completely. An hour ago, his biggest concern had been quarterly profit margins. Now, all he could think about was the fact that a young woman had been surviving on nothing for days, to the point where she was forced to search through garbage for scraps of food. "Go change," he said gently. "And then we'll take care of the rest." Maria nodded and disappeared down the hallway with the dry clothes. Alexander used the time to think about what he was doing. This was not typical behavior for him. He was not known for his charity work or his concern for individual cases of hardship. His philanthropy was limited to large donations to established organizations, actions that were as much about tax benefits and public image as they were about helping others. But something about Maria's situation had reached him in a way that surprised him. Perhaps it was the dignity with which she carried herself despite her circumstances, or maybe it was the realization that desperation could affect anyone, regardless of their character or work ethic. Whatever the reason, Alexander found himself committed to helping this young woman, even though he had no clear idea of what that help should look like. When Maria returned to the kitchen, she looked completely different. The dry clothes, though obviously too large, made her appear younger and more vulnerable. She had used the towel to dry her hair, and Without the rain-soaked strands plastering it to her head, Alexander could see that it was actually quite beautiful, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly, holding up the wet clothes she had been wearing. "I don't know how to repay you for this." "You don't need to repay me," Alexander said. "But, you do need to eat something substantial. When you say you haven't eaten since Tuesday, what exactly did you have then?" Maria looked embarrassed. "A sandwich from a convenience store. It was past the expiration date, so they were selling it for $1. Alexander opened the refrigerator, a massive stainless steel unit that was always kept well stocked by his household staff. Inside, he could see the leftovers from the dinner that Henri had prepared for him earlier in the week, along with fresh ingredients for meals he had not yet had time to eat. The abundance was almost overwhelming when viewed through the lens of Maria's hunger. "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward the small table near the window where the kitchen staff usually took their meals. "Let me make you something." As Maria sat down, Alexander began pulling items from the refrigerator. He was not much of a cook, preferring to leave such tasks to the professionals he employed, but he could certainly manage to prepare a basic meal. He found some leftover roast chicken, fresh bread, vegetables, and cheese, and began assembling what he hoped would be a satisfying and nourishing meal for someone who had been surviving on scraps. While he worked, Alexander found himself stealing glances at Maria. She sat very still at the table, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with an expression that mixed gratitude with disbelief. It occurred to him that this was probably the strangest evening of both their lives, a billionaire preparing food for a woman he had found eating from his garbage bins. "Tell me about yourself," Alexander said as he sliced the chicken. "Where are you from?" Maria was quiet for a moment before answering. "I grew up in a small town about 2 hours from here. My parents died in a car accident when I was 18, and I came to the city to find work. I've been on my own ever since." "That must have been difficult," Alexander said, surprised by how much he wanted to know more about her story. "It was," Maria admitted. "But I managed okay for a while. I had the job at the hotel, and I was renting a small apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Then, everything started falling apart at once." Alexander placed a plate in front of her with generous portions of chicken, bread, vegetables, and cheese. He also poured her a glass of milk and set it down beside the plate. Maria stared at the food as if she could not quite believe it was real. "Please," Alexander said, sitting down across from her. "Eat." Maria took a small bite of the chicken, and Alexander watched as her eyes closed in apparent relief. She chewed slowly, savoring the taste in a way that reminded him how much he took for granted in his own life. When was the last time he had truly appreciated a meal, rather than eating quickly between meetings or while reviewing documents? "This is delicious," Maria said after swallowing. "Thank you so much." "It's just leftovers," Alexander said, but he found himself pleased by her reaction. As Maria continued to eat, Alexander learned more about her circumstances. The job loss at the hotel had been sudden, part of a round of layoffs that had affected nearly half the housekeeping staff. Without steady income, she had quickly fallen behind on rent and had been evicted from her apartment. Her car had been her only remaining shelter, but when it broke down, she had been left with nowhere to go and no resources to fix it. "I've been applying for jobs everywhere," she explained between bites. "But most places want references, and the hotel is so overwhelmed with their own problems that they're not responding to reference requests. It's like being caught in a circle with no way out." Alexander listened to her story with growing discomfort, not because of Maria herself, but because of what her situation revealed about the world he lived in. He had always known, intellectually, that economic hardship existed, but he had never been confronted with it so directly. Maria was not a statistic or a case study, she was a real person who had been working and trying to build a life, only to have circumstances beyond her control sweep that life away. "Where have you been sleeping since your car broke down?" he asked. Maria looked down at her plate. "There's a bus station downtown that stays open all night. The security guards are usually kind enough to let people rest there if they're not causing trouble. But during the day, you have to leave." The image of Maria spending her nights in a bus station, hungry and homeless, was one that Alexander found deeply disturbing. He tried to imagine what it would be like to have no place to call home, no certainty about where your next meal would come from, no safety net to catch you when everything went wrong. "Maria," he said carefully, "what would it take to get you back on your feet?" She looked up at him with surprise. "I don't know," she said honestly. "A job, I suppose. Somewhere to live. A chance to save some money so that one emergency doesn't destroy everything again." Alexander found himself thinking about the resources at his disposal. The Sterling mansion employed dozens of people in various capacities: gardeners, security guards, maintenance workers, cleaning staff, and administrative assistants. His businesses employed thousands more. Surely there was something Maria could do, some position that would give her the stability she needed to rebuild her life. "I have an idea," he said, the plan forming in his mind even as he spoke. "But I want you to finish eating first, and then we'll discuss it." Maria nodded and returned her attention to the plate of food. Alexander watched her eat with the same careful appreciation she had shown for the bread she had found in his garbage. Every bite was deliberate and grateful, a reminder of how precious basic sustenance could be to someone who had been without it. As the storm continued to rage outside, Alexander found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If he had not been working late in his office, if he had not looked out the window at just the right time, if he had simply called security instead of investigating himself, he never would have met Maria. He never would have learned her story, and she would have continued to struggle alone in the darkness. But now that he had met her, now that he knew what was happening just beyond the walls of his comfortable mansion, Alexander found that he could not simply return to his previous ignorance. Something had changed in him during the course of this evening, something that he did not yet fully understand but that he knew would have lasting consequences. When Maria finished eating, she leaned back in her chair with a sigh of satisfaction. "I can't remember the last time I felt this full," she said. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough, but thank you." "Maria," Alexander said, leaning forward slightly. "I want to offer you a job." Her eyes widened in surprise. "A job?" "I need someone to help manage the household staff here at the mansion. It would involve coordinating with the various people who work on the property, making sure everything runs smoothly, handling scheduling and supplies. It's a live-in position, with your own room and meals provided, plus a salary that should allow you to start saving money again." Maria stared at him for a long moment, and Alexander could see that she was struggling to process what he was saying. "You're offering me a job," she repeated. "But you don't know anything about me. You don't know if I'm reliable or honest or capable of doing what you're describing." "You worked at the Grand Plaza for 2 years," Alexander pointed out. "That tells me you're reliable. And, as for honesty, I've just watched you go through my garbage looking for food rather than trying to break into my house or steal something valuable. That tells me a lot about your character. But this is..." Maria gestured around the elaborate kitchen. "This is a huge house. Managing staff here would be a big responsibility. Why would you trust someone you just met with something like that?" It was a fair question, and Alexander realized that he did not have a completely rational answer. Everything about this situation went against his usual careful, calculated approach to decision-making. But something about Maria's story, about her dignity in the face of desperate circumstances, had convinced him that she deserved a chance. "Sometimes," he said finally, "you have to trust your instincts about people." Maria was quiet for a long time, and Alexander could see that she was thinking carefully about his offer. Finally, she spoke. "I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for charity. If you're offering me this job because you feel sorry for me, I can't accept it. I need to earn my place here." Alexander nodded, impressed by her response. "I wouldn't offer you a job I didn't think you could do," he said. "And I wouldn't run my household based on charity. If I hire you, it will be because I believe you can handle the responsibilities I'm describing. And if I can't? Then, we'll figure that out when we come to it," Alexander said. "But I think you'll surprise yourself with what you're capable of when you're not worried about where your next meal is coming from." Maria stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the storm that was finally beginning to show signs of weakening. Alexander waited quietly, understanding that this decision would affect the entire trajectory of her life. After several minutes, she turned back to face him. "I accept," she said simply. "And I promise you won't regret giving me this chance." As Alexander looked at Maria standing in his kitchen, still wearing his oversized clothes, still showing the effects of days without proper food or shelter, he realized that this evening had changed both of their lives in ways they could not yet imagine. He had started the night reviewing profit reports and had ended it offering a home and a job to a stranger he had found eating from his garbage. Tomorrow, he would have to explain to his household staff that they had a new supervisor. He would have to show Maria around the mansion and help her understand the scope of her new responsibilities. He would have to figure out how to integrate someone with her background into the carefully ordered world he had built for himself. But tonight, as the storm finally began to pass and Maria accepted his offer with a mixture of gratitude and determination, Alexander felt something he had not experienced in years. He felt like he had done something that mattered, something that went beyond profit margins and business deals and the accumulation of wealth and power. He had given someone a second chance, and, in doing so, had perhaps given himself one as well. 3 weeks had passed since that stormy night when Alexander found Maria searching through his garbage bins. In that time, the Sterling mansion had undergone changes that were both subtle and profound. Maria had settled into her role as household coordinator with a dedication and competence that impressed everyone, including Alexander himself, who had spent those weeks quietly observing how she handled her new responsibilities. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the main dining room as Alexander sat at the mahogany table, reading the morning news on his tablet while Henri prepared his usual breakfast of fresh fruit, artisanal bread, and coffee imported from a small farm in Colombia. It was a routine that had remained unchanged for years, but lately, Alexander found himself paying more attention to details he had previously taken for granted. Maria appeared in the doorway, carrying a clipboard and wearing the professional attire that Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, had helped her select during her first week. The transformation from the rain-soaked woman he had encountered 3 weeks ago was remarkable. Her dark hair was now styled neatly, her posture conveyed confidence, and her eyes held a brightness that had been absent on that desperate night. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice carrying the respectful tone she maintained during their professional interactions. "I have the weekly household report ready for your review." Alexander gestured for her to sit down, something that had initially made Maria uncomfortable but which had become part of their routine. "Please, go ahead." As Maria reviewed the various household matters, maintenance schedules, staff coordination, supply orders, Alexander found himself studying her face. She approached every task with meticulous attention to detail, and her suggestions for improving efficiency had already saved both time and money. More importantly, the other staff members had begun to respect her authority, despite their initial skepticism about her sudden appearance in their carefully ordered world. "The gardening crew will need approval for the seasonal plantings," Maria continued, flipping through her notes. "Mr. Rodriguez has prepared a proposal that includes both aesthetic improvements and cost reductions by sourcing some materials locally rather than importing everything." "Approved," Alexander said immediately. In the past, he would have requested detailed cost analyses and multiple rounds of review before making such decisions. But Maria's recommendations had proven consistently sound, and he had learned to trust her judgment. "There's one more thing," Maria said, hesitating slightly. "Mrs. Chen mentioned that the charity gala you're hosting next month will require additional temporary staff. She's asked me to coordinate the hiring process." Alexander nodded. The annual Sterling Foundation Gala was one of the largest social events of the year, bringing together hundreds of the city's most influential people to raise money for various charitable causes. It was the kind of event that required months of planning and flawless execution. "How do you feel about taking on that responsibility?" Alexander asked. "Honored," Maria replied immediately. "And terrified," she added with a smile that made Alexander's chest tighten in a way he had not expected. Over the past 3 weeks, Alexander had begun to notice things about Maria that went beyond her professional capabilities. The way she hummed softly while she worked, the kindness she showed to every member of the household staff regardless of their position, the way she always saved a portion of her meals for later, as if part of her still could not quite believe that food would continue to be available. "I have complete confidence in your ability to handle it," Alexander said, and he meant it. "But, if you need anything, any resources or support, don't hesitate to ask." As Maria gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Alexander found himself wanting to extend the conversation. "Maria," he said, causing her to pause at the doorway. "Are you settling in well? Is your room comfortable? Is there anything you need?" "Everything is perfect," she said. "More than perfect. I still can't quite believe this is my life now." After Maria left, Alexander remained at the dining table longer than usual, his breakfast growing cold as he thought about the changes that had occurred since her arrival. The mansion ran more smoothly than it had in years, but that was not what occupied his thoughts. Instead, he found himself thinking about Maria's laugh when one of the gardeners told her a joke, or the way she insisted on learning everyone's names and remembering details about their families. Alexander's personal assistant, David, appeared in the doorway with the day's schedule. "Your 10 o'clock meeting with the Japanese investors has been moved to 11, David announced, scanning his tablet. "And, your mother called to remind you about dinner on Sunday." "Thank you, David," Alexander said, forcing his attention back to business matters. "What do you know about Maria's background check?" David looked up from his tablet with mild surprise. "The household coordinator?" "The background check came back clean, as expected. Former employer confirms she was a model employee, no criminal history, excellent references from previous landlords." "Why do you ask?" "Just making sure we did our due diligence," Alexander said, though that was not entirely true. What he really wanted to know was more about Maria's life before she came to work for him, but he had not been able to think of a professional way to ask such questions. The morning passed quickly with meetings and phone calls, but Alexander found his concentration suffering. Usually, business occupied his complete attention, the complex negotiations and strategic decisions demanding every ounce of his mental energy. Today, however, he kept finding his thoughts drifting to Maria and wondering what she was doing at any given moment. During his lunch break, Alexander decided to take a walk through the mansion, something he rarely did during business hours. He told himself he was checking on various maintenance projects, but, in reality, he hoped to encounter Maria and perhaps learn more about how she was adjusting to her new life. He found her in the library, standing on a stepladder while carefully dusting the higher shelves. The library was one of Alexander's favorite rooms in the mansion, filled with first-edition books and comfortable leather chairs that invited long hours of reading. Maria moved through the space with obvious respect for the valuable volumes surrounding her. "Finding everything you need?" Alexander asked, causing Maria to look down at him with surprise. "Mr. Sterling," she said, stepping down from the ladder. "I didn't hear you come in." "I'm just finishing the weekly cleaning rotation Mrs. Chen set up for this room." "Please, don't let me interrupt," Alexander said, settling into one of the leather chairs. "I don't often have a chance to spend time in here during the day." Maria returned to her work, but Alexander could sense that his presence made her slightly nervous. "Do you enjoy reading?" he asked. "I do," Maria replied, carefully cleaning the spine of a leather-bound volume. "I used to spend hours at the public library when I was younger. Books were free entertainment, and the library was warm in the winter." "What kinds of books do you prefer?" Maria paused in her dusting and looked at him thoughtfully. "I know I probably should say something impressive, like classic literature or philosophy. But, honestly, I love stories about people overcoming difficult circumstances. Stories where characters find strength they didn't know they had." Alexander felt that familiar tightness in his chest. "Those sound like exactly the kinds of books worth reading." "What about you?" Maria asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be asking personal questions." "Of course you should," Alexander said, surprising himself. "I tend to read biographies of business leaders and historical figures. Though lately, I've been thinking I should branch out into other genres." Maria smiled, and Alexander realized it was the first time their conversation had felt completely natural, without the careful boundaries that usually defined their interactions. "I could recommend some books," she offered tentatively. I would like that very much, Alexander replied. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Chen appearing in the doorway. Maria, dear, the older woman said, the florist is here for the weekly arrangement consultation. They're waiting in the garden room. Of course, Maria said, immediately stepping down from the ladder. Excuse me, Mr. Sterling. As Maria hurried away, Alexander remained in the library, thinking about their brief conversation. There had been something different about the way she spoke when she was talking about books, a passion and intelligence that went far beyond the professional competence she displayed in her work. He found himself curious about what other aspects of her personality he had not yet discovered. That evening, Alexander worked later than usual in his office, partly because of genuine business needs but partly because he found the mansion felt different when Maria was not moving through it during her daily duties. Around 9 o'clock, he decided to take a break and walked downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. He found Maria sitting at the small table where she had eaten that first meal, reading a book by the light of the pendant lamp above the table. She looked up when he entered, immediately starting to rise from her chair. Please, don't get up, Alexander said. I just came down for some water. What are you reading? Maria held up the book so he could see the cover. It was a novel about a woman who started her own business during the Great Depression. It's one of my recommendations, she said with a shy smile. Alexander poured himself a glass of water and, after a moment's hesitation, sat down across from Maria at the table. Tell me about it. As Maria described the story, her face became animated in a way Alexander had never seen during their professional interactions. She spoke about the protagonist's determination, her clever solutions to impossible problems, and the way she helped other women in her community build better lives for themselves. She reminds me of you, actually, Maria said, then immediately looked embarrassed. I mean, the way you built your business from nothing. The way you saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. Alexander was quiet for a moment. I had advantages she didn't have, he said finally. I was born into a family with connections and resources. My path to success was difficult, but it was never desperate. But you still had to work for everything you achieved, Maria pointed out. Having advantages doesn't diminish the effort you put in. It was a perspective Alexander had never considered before. He had always been conscious of his privileged background, sometimes feeling that it invalidated his accomplishments. But Maria's words suggested a more nuanced view of success and effort. What about you? Alexander asked. What advantages have you had? Maria laughed, but not bitterly. I guess I've always been stubborn, she said. My parents used to say I was too stubborn for my own good. When things get difficult, I have trouble accepting that there's no solution. That served you well here, Alexander observed. You've solved problems that have been frustrating the household staff for months. It's different when you have resources to work with, Maria said. When you're not spending all your energy just trying to survive, you can actually think about how to make things better. The comment hung in the air between them, a reminder of the circumstances that had brought Maria into his life. Alexander found himself thinking about that night 3 weeks ago, about how different things could have been if he had not looked out his window at exactly the right moment. Maria, he said carefully, can I ask you something personal? She nodded, though he could see her tensing slightly. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met that night? Maria was quiet for a long time, her fingers absently turning the pages of her book. Every day, she said finally. I try not to, because it makes me feel sick to think about it. But, every day. What do you think would have happened? I don't know, Maria admitted. Maybe I would have found another job eventually. Maybe I would have figured something out. But, honestly? I was running out of options pretty quickly. I was running out of hope even faster. Alexander felt a chill run through him at her words. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't have asked that. No, it's okay, Maria said, looking up at him. I think about it because it helps me appreciate what I have now. Every morning when I wake up in a real bed, in a warm room, knowing that I have work to do and food to eat, I remember how different things were just 3 weeks ago.
Do you ever regret accepting my offer? Alexander asked. How could I? Maria replied, genuine surprise in her voice. You saved my life, Mr. Sterling. You gave me back my dignity and my future. I will never be able to repay you for that. You don't need to repay me, Alexander said.
You've more than earned your place here through your own hard work. As they continued talking, Alexander realized that this was the longest personal conversation he had had with anyone in years. Usually, his interactions were limited to business discussions, brief pleasantries with family members, or the superficial exchanges that characterized his social life. But, with Maria, conversation felt natural and meaningful in a way that surprised him.
The next morning brought an unexpected complication.
Alexander was in his office reviewing contracts when David knocked on the door with an expression of concern.
Sir, David said, there's a man downstairs asking to speak with Maria. He says he's her former landlord, and he seems quite agitated. Alexander felt a surge of protective anger that caught him off guard. What does he want?
He's claiming she owes him money for damages to the apartment she was renting.
He's demanding to speak with her immediately. Where is Maria now?
She's in the garden with the landscaping crew, reviewing the seasonal planting plans.
Alexander stood up from his desk. I'll handle this. Please ask Maria to remain in the garden until I call for her. Sir, are you sure you want to get involved in what might be a personal matter? Alexander paused, recognizing the wisdom in David's question. Under normal circumstances, he would have stayed out of any personal disputes involving his employees.
But something about the situation felt wrong to him, and his protective instincts were stronger than his usual professional detachment.
Yes, he said firmly. I'm sure.
Alexander made his way downstairs to find a middle-aged man with unkempt hair and wrinkled clothing waiting in the main foyer.
The man seemed agitated and was looking around the mansion with obvious envy and resentment.
I'm Alexander Sterling, Alexander announced, his voice carrying the authority that made grown men nervous in boardrooms.
I understand you want to speak with one of my employees. The man turned toward Alexander with a mixture of surprise and opportunism in his eyes.
Mr. Sterling, he said, his tone immediately becoming obsequious. I'm Danny Rodriguez, and I need to collect some money that Maria Santos owes me.
What kind of money? Alexander asked, though his tone suggested he was not particularly interested in accommodating the request.
Damages to the apartment she was renting from me, Rodriguez said. She left the place in terrible condition, and I had to spend a lot of money fixing it up for the next tenant. Alexander studied Rodriguez carefully, noting the expensive watch on his wrist and the calculating look in his eyes. Something about the man's story did not ring true.
How much money are we talking about? Alexander asked.
$2,000, Rodriguez said immediately.
Plus interest for the time it's taken me to track her down. Do you have documentation of these damages? Receipts for the repair work? Photos of the apartment's condition when she left? Rodriguez's expression shifted slightly. Well, I don't have all of that with me right now, but I can get it. I see, Alexander said. And you say you've been trying to track Maria down to collect this money? That's right. She disappeared without leaving a forwarding address. It took me weeks to find out where she was working. Alexander felt his anger building. The story Rodriguez was telling made no sense. If Maria had truly damaged an apartment and disappeared without paying for it, why would Rodriguez only now be tracking her down? And if she had been evicted for non-payment of rent, as Maria had told him, how could she simultaneously owe money for damages?
Mr. Rodriguez, Alexander said, his voice taking on the cold tone he used when he was about to destroy someone in a business negotiation, I think there's been a misunderstanding.
What kind of misunderstanding?
The kind where you think you can show up at my home and intimidate one of my employees into giving you money she doesn't owe you.
Rodriguez's face reddened. Now wait a minute.
That girl owes me money, and I have every right to collect it.
Do you? Alexander asked.
Because what I think happened is this: you evicted Maria for non-payment of rent when she lost her job, which was your legal right. But now you've discovered that she's found a good position with a wealthy family, and you've decided to try to extort some money from the situation. That's not true, Rodriguez protested, but his voice lacked conviction.
Here's what's going to happen, Alexander continued. You're going to leave my property immediately.
If you want to pursue any legitimate claim against Maria, you can do so through the proper legal channels. But if you ever come here again, or if you harass Maria in any way, I will use every legal resource at my disposal to make your life very difficult. Rodriguez opened his mouth to protest, but Alexander cut him off. I employ some of the best lawyers in the city, Mr. Rodriguez. They would be very interested in investigating your rental practices and tax filings. I suspect they would find some interesting discrepancies.
The threat was clear, and Rodriguez seemed to deflate under Alexander's intense stare.
You can't protect her forever, he muttered.
Actually, Alexander said with a smile that held no warmth, I can. And I will.
After Rodriguez left, Alexander found Maria in the garden, kneeling beside a flower bed while discussing plant arrangements with the head gardener. She looked up when she saw him approaching, and he could see the worry in her eyes.
Is everything okay? She asked. David said someone was looking for me. It's been taken care of, Alexander said.
Your former landlord was here trying to collect money he claimed you owed him for apartment damages.
I sent him away. Maria's face went pale. Mr. Rodriguez was here? What did he want?
$2,000, allegedly for damages to your apartment. I told him that if he had legitimate claims, he could pursue them through proper legal channels. Maria stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. I didn't damage that apartment, she said quietly. When I was evicted, I left it cleaner than it was when I moved in. I took pictures because I was hoping to get my security deposit back.
I assumed as much, Alexander said. Men like Rodriguez are opportunists.
They see someone who appears to be doing well, and they try to find ways to profit from it. I'm sorry he came here, Maria said.
I'm sorry my problems followed me to your home.
Maria, Alexander said firmly, you don't have any problems.
Rodriguez is not your problem anymore. He's not anyone's problem anymore.
As they walked back toward the house together, Alexander found himself thinking about the protective anger he had felt when confronting Rodriguez. It was not the kind of emotion he usually experienced in defense of an employee. It was something more personal, more intense. The idea of anyone trying to intimidate or exploit Maria had triggered a response in him that went far beyond professional concern. That evening, Maria knocked on the door of Alexander's office. When he looked up from his computer, he could see that she was struggling with something. Thank you, she said simply. For what you did today. For protecting me from Mr. Rodriguez. You don't need to thank me, Alexander replied. Any decent person would have done the same thing. No, Maria said, shaking her head. Most people would have stayed out of it. They would have said it was my personal business and not gotten involved. You didn't have to stand up for me, but you did. Alexander set down his pen and gave Maria his full attention. Maria, I want you to understand something. As long as you work here, as long as you're part of this household, you're under my protection. People like Rodriguez don't get to come here and make demands or threats. But why? Maria asked. Why do you care so much about what happens to me? It was a question Alexander had been asking himself for weeks, and he still did not have a complete answer. All he knew was that Maria's well-being had become important to him in ways that went beyond their professional relationship. Because, he said finally, everyone deserves to feel safe and respected. Everyone deserves a chance to build a good life without being preyed upon by people who see vulnerability as an opportunity. Maria was quiet for a moment, studying his face. I think there's more to it than that, she said softly. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? I think you care about me, Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not just as an employee, but as a person. And I think maybe I care about you too, in ways that probably aren't appropriate for someone in my position. The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Alexander felt his carefully controlled world shifting on its foundation, and, for the first time in years, he had no idea what to do next. The words Maria had spoken in Alexander's office 2 nights ago continued to echo in his mind as he stood in the main ballroom of the Sterling mansion, watching the final preparations for the annual Sterling Foundation Gala. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in white silk, each centerpiece a masterpiece of white roses and gold accents that Maria had personally designed with the florist. The room looked magnificent, exactly the kind of elegant setting that would impress the city's elite and encourage generous donations. But Alexander found it difficult to concentrate on the details that usually demanded his complete attention. Instead, his eyes kept searching for Maria among the staff members bustling through their final preparations. She had been working 18-hour days for the past week, coordinating with caterers, decorators, security personnel, and the dozens of temporary staff hired for the evening. Her organizational skills had transformed what could have been a chaotic event into a seamlessly orchestrated affair. "Alexander, darling," came the familiar voice of his mother, Margaret Sterling, as she approached him across the polished marble floor. At 62, Margaret remained an elegant and imposing woman, her silver hair styled perfectly and her designer gown making a statement about both wealth and taste. "The ballroom looks absolutely stunning. I must say, whoever coordinated this event has exceptional taste." "That would be Maria Santos," Alexander replied, finally, spotting Maria near the entrance as she reviewed seating arrangements with David. "Our new household coordinator." Margaret followed her son's gaze and raised an eyebrow. "The young woman who's been causing such a stir among the household staff? What do you mean by that?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he knew exactly what his mother was referring to. "Mrs. Chen mentioned that you hired someone quite suddenly, without going through the usual interview process. She also mentioned that this Maria person seems to have captured your attention in ways that go beyond her professional duties." Alexander felt heat rise in his face. He should have expected that his mother would hear about Maria through the household staff network. Margaret Sterling had always maintained close relationships with the people who worked in the mansion, and very little escaped her notice. "Maria is an excellent employee who has improved the efficiency of household operations significantly," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I'm sure she has," Margaret replied with the knowing smile that had made Alexander uncomfortable since childhood. "And I'm equally sure that's not the only reason you've been distracted lately." Before Alexander could respond to his mother's observation, Maria appeared at his elbow with her clipboard and the professional demeanor she maintained during public events. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "the first guests will be arriving in 30 minutes. The catering staff is ready, security is in position, and the musicians are finishing their sound check. Is there anything specific you'd like me to address before the evening begins?" "Everything sounds perfect," Alexander replied, noting how Maria's presence seemed to change the energy around him. "Maria, I'd like you to meet my mother." "Mother, this is Maria Santos, the coordinator who has made tonight's event possible." Margaret extended her hand with the gracious smile she used for people she was evaluating. "Miss Santos, it's a pleasure to meet you. The ballroom looks absolutely beautiful." "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling," Maria replied, her handshake firm and confident despite what Alexander could detect as nervousness. "I've heard so much about your involvement with the Sterling Foundation's charitable work." "Have you indeed?" Margaret's smile became more genuine. "Alexander, you haven't told me that Ms. Santos was interested in our charitable activities." "Maria has been instrumental in organizing tonight's event," Alexander said, realizing that his mother was already beginning her evaluation process. "Without her coordination, we would never have been able to manage all the details." As if summoned by the mention of details, David appeared with a small crisis that required Maria's immediate attention. She excused herself politely, leaving Alexander alone with his mother's knowing gaze. "She's very lovely," Margaret observed. "And clearly competent. But there's something else about her, isn't there?" "What do you mean?" "She looks at you the way a woman looks at a man she cares about," Margaret said directly. "And you look at her the same way." Alexander felt the conversation moving into territory he was not prepared to navigate,
particularly not 30 minutes before hosting 300 of the city's most influential people.
Mother, this is neither the time nor the place for this discussion.
Perhaps not, Margaret agreed. But, Alexander, you should know that everyone can see what's happening between you two. The question is what you plan to do about it. The arrival of the first guest saved Alexander from having to respond to his mother's observation.
For the next hour, he found himself occupied with the familiar rituals of hosting a major social event, greeting donors, introducing speakers, ensuring that everyone felt appropriately welcomed and appreciated. It was a role he had played dozens of times before, the polished performance of a successful businessman supporting worthy causes. But, throughout the evening, Alexander found his attention repeatedly drawn to Maria as she moved through the crowd, ensuring that every aspect of the event ran smoothly. She had changed from her day clothes into a simple but elegant black dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her select, and Alexander was struck by how naturally she fit into the formal atmosphere despite her recent introduction to this world. During the dinner portion of the evening, Alexander delivered his annual remarks about the Sterling Foundation's mission and the importance of supporting community organizations. As he spoke from the small stage at one end of the ballroom, his eyes found Maria standing near the back of the room, watching with an expression of pride and admiration that made his carefully prepared words feel suddenly more meaningful. The Sterling Foundation exists because we believe that everyone deserves an opportunity to build a better life, Alexander said, his voice carrying across the room. Sometimes that opportunity comes in the form of education or job training. Sometimes it comes as emergency assistance during difficult times. But, always, it comes with the recognition that individual circumstances do not define individual worth. As he spoke these words, Alexander found himself thinking about Maria's journey from desperation to dignity, and how much his own understanding of opportunity and worth had evolved since meeting her. After the formal program concluded and the guests moved into the reception areas for continued socializing, Alexander was approached by Senator Patricia Williams, one of the foundation's most prominent supporters. "Alexander," the senator said warmly, "another exceptional event. The coordination was flawless, and the presentation was particularly moving this year."
"Thank you, Senator. We have an excellent team managing the details.
I was particularly impressed with the young woman who seemed to be overseeing everything.
I don't believe I've met her before."
Alexander glanced around the room and spotted Maria coordinating with the catering staff to begin the dessert service.
"That's Maria Santos, our household coordinator."
"She has a remarkable presence," Senator Williams observed. "Professional but warm, authoritative but approachable. You don't often see that combination, especially in someone so young."
"Maria has exceeded every expectation," Alexander agreed.
"You know," the senator continued thoughtfully, "we're looking for someone to manage our upcoming literacy initiative. It's a significant project that requires someone who can coordinate multiple organizations while maintaining relationships with various stakeholders. If your Ms. Santos is ever interested in expanding her horizons, I'd love to speak with her."
The comment caught Alexander off guard.
The idea of Maria leaving the mansion, of no longer being part of his daily life, created an immediate sense of loss that surprised him with its intensity.
"I'll let her know about the opportunity," he said, though every instinct told him not to.
As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Alexander found himself helping with the cleanup efforts alongside the staff. It was not something he usually did, preferring to leave such tasks to the professionals he employed, but tonight he felt restless and unable to simply retreat to his office while others worked. He found Maria in the kitchen, reviewing the evening's expenses with Henri and making notes about what had worked well and what could be improved for future events. She looked tired but satisfied, the kind of exhaustion that came from hard work successfully completed.
"How do you think it went?"
Alexander asked, settling into a chair near the table where she was working. "Better than I had hoped," Maria replied with a smile. "The guests seemed genuinely engaged with the Foundation's mission, and I heard several conversations about increased support for next year." Senator Williams was particularly impressed with the coordination.
"She actually asked me to let you know about a position managing her literacy initiative." Alexander watched Maria's face carefully as he delivered this information.
He saw surprise, followed by something that might have been interest, then, a more complex expression that seemed to involve both opportunity and conflict.
That's very flattering, Maria said slowly. What kind of position? Alexander found himself reluctant to provide details that might make the opportunity more appealing. Project management, stakeholder coordination, community outreach. The kind of work you've been doing here, but on a larger scale.
Maria was quiet for a moment, her pen moving absently across her notes.
Can I ask you something, Mr. Sterling?
Of course.
Do you think I should consider it? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow.
Here was an opportunity for Maria to advance her career, to move beyond the domestic sphere into work that would challenge her abilities and provide greater recognition for her talents.
Any reasonable employer would encourage such advancement.
But Alexander discovered that he was not feeling reasonable. That depends on what you want from your career, he said carefully.
And what you want from your life.
What I want, Maria said quietly, is to continue working with people I respect, in an environment where I feel valued and appreciated.
I want to build something meaningful, something that matters.
All of those things could be true in the senator's organization, Alexander pointed out, hating himself for the words even as he spoke them.
They could be, Maria agreed. But they're already true here.
The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Chin appearing in the doorway to report that the last of the cleanup had been completed and the temporary staff had been dismissed. As the older woman provided her summary of the evening's successes, Alexander found himself studying Maria's face, trying to understand the emotions playing across her features. After Mrs. Chen left, Maria began gathering her papers and preparing to end her workday. It was nearly 2 a.m, and Alexander realized that she had been working for almost 20 hours straight to ensure the evening's success. "Maria," he said as she stood to leave, "what you accomplished tonight was extraordinary. The entire evening was flawless, and that's entirely due to your efforts."
"Thank you," she replied. "But it wasn't just my efforts. Everyone worked together to make it successful."
"Nevertheless," Alexander continued, "you should know that your work here is appreciated more than you might realize." Maria stopped gathering her papers and looked directly at him.
"Mr. Sterling, can I be completely honest with you?" Alexander felt his pulse quicken. "Always. The other night, when I said that I thought we cared about each other in ways that weren't appropriate, you didn't respond. I've been wondering if I made you uncomfortable, or if I misunderstood something about our relationship." Alexander had been dreading and hoping for this conversation in equal measure. "You didn't misunderstand anything," he said quietly. "And you didn't make me uncomfortable. You made me realize something I'd been trying not to acknowledge." "Which is?" Alexander stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where he had first seen Maria searching through his garbage bins 2 months ago. "Which is that somewhere along the way, you stopped being just an employee to me. You became someone I care about, someone I think about, someone whose happiness matters to me in ways that go far beyond professional concern." Maria joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could catch the faint scent of her perfume. "And that frightens you?" "Terrifies me," Alexander admitted. "Because I don't know how to navigate a situation like this. I don't know what's appropriate or fair or wise. What would happen if we stopped worrying about what's appropriate?" Maria asked softly. Alexander turned to face her, seeing his own feelings reflected in her eyes. "I don't know. That's what terrifies me." For a moment, they stood facing each other in the quiet kitchen, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Alexander felt as though he was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward would change everything irrevocably. "Maria," he said finally, "there are things you don't know about my world, about what it would mean to be involved with someone like me. There are expectations and pressures and complications that, what if I don't care about any of that?" Maria interrupted. "What if all I care about is how I feel when I'm with you?" "How do you feel when you're with you?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Safe," Maria said immediately. "Valued. Like I matter to someone who matters to me. Like I'm not just surviving anymore, but actually living.
Alexander felt something break loose inside his chest, some barrier he had maintained for years finally crumbling under the weight of Maria's honesty.
I feel the same way, he admitted. When I'm with you, everything else seems less important.
Business deals that used to consume my thoughts, social obligations that used to define my schedule, none of it seems to matter as much as making sure you're happy.
So what do we do about that? Maria asked. I don't know, Alexander replied honestly. But I think we need to figure it out together.
As if drawn by forces beyond their control, they moved closer to each other until they were standing just inches apart. Alexander could see the flecks of gold in Maria's brown eyes, could count the freckles across her nose that makeup never quite concealed. Alexander, Maria said, using his first name for the first time, I need you to know something.
What?
I'm not looking for you to save me or take care of me or solve my problems.
You already did that when you gave me this job. What I'm looking for now is something completely different.
What are you looking for? A partnership, Maria said simply. Someone to share life with, to build something with, to face whatever comes with.
Someone who sees me as an equal, even if our bank accounts will never be equal.
Alexander reached up and touched her face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. You are my equal, he said firmly.
In every way that matters, you are absolutely my equal.
When their lips finally met, it was with the tentative sweetness of two people who had been carefully circling each other for weeks, afraid to acknowledge what they both knew was inevitable. The kiss was gentle at first, then deeper as they gave in to feelings that had been building since that first night when Alexander had found Maria in his kitchen. When they finally broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead against Maria's, both of them breathing heavily.
This changes everything, he said.
I know, Maria replied.
Are you ready for that?
Alexander thought about his carefully ordered life, about the expectations that came with his position, about the complications that would inevitably arise from a relationship that crossed so many social and economic boundaries. Then, he thought about Maria's laugh when she was truly happy, about the way she had transformed not just his household but his entire perspective on what mattered in life. I think I've been ready for a long time, he said.
I just needed to find the right person to change everything with.
As they stood together in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of an evening that had brought together hundreds of people to support worthy causes, Alexander realized that the most important thing he had discovered that night was not about charitable giving or social responsibility. It was about the fact that love could appear in the most unexpected circumstances, between the most unlikely people, and change everything in ways that no amount of planning or preparation could anticipate. But, even as he held Maria close and felt more content than he had in years, Alexander knew that their journey was just beginning. Tomorrow, they would have to face the reactions of family, friends, and society to their relationship. They would have to navigate the complexities of building a life together across vast differences in background and experience. They would have to prove, to themselves and to others, that what they had found was real and lasting and worth fighting for. Tonight, however, all of that seemed manageable as long as they were facing it together. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling felt like he had found something more valuable than money or power or status. He had found someone who made him want to be better than he was, someone who saw beyond his wealth to the person he could become. And, in Maria's arms, surrounded by the evidence of what they could accomplish when they worked together, Alexander finally understood what it meant to feel truly rich. The morning after the gala, Alexander woke to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of his master bedroom, feeling more rested than he had in months despite having only slept for 4 hours. The memory of kissing Maria in the kitchen filled his mind, and he found himself smiling as he reviewed the events that had led to that moment. For the first time in years, he was eager to begin his day, not because of business obligations or professional responsibilities, but because he would see Maria again. As he dressed for the day, Alexander's phone rang with a call from David, who was clearly exhausted but determined to maintain his professional efficiency. Good morning, Mr. Sterling, David said, his voice slightly hoarse from the late night. I have the preliminary report on last night's donations. The initial numbers are very encouraging. Excellent, Alexander replied, though he found himself more interested in other aspects of the previous evening. How did the cleanup go? Any issues with the catering or security?
None at all, David reported. Maria had contingency plans for everything. I've never seen an event run so smoothly.
Several of the guests specifically commented on the organization.
Good. Make sure Maria knows about the positive feedback.
There was a slight pause before David continued.
Sir, if I may ask, what should I tell Senator Williams about her job offer for Maria?
She called this morning to follow up.
Alexander felt that familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of Maria potentially leaving.
Tell the senator that I'll discuss the opportunity with Maria and have her contact the senator's office directly. After ending the call, Alexander realized that he was facing the first real test of his commitment to treating Maria as an equal partner rather than someone whose decisions he could control. The job opportunity with Senator Williams was genuinely excellent, and, if Maria was interested in it, he would have to support her choice even if it meant losing her presence in his daily life.
Alexander made his way downstairs to find the mansion restored to its usual pristine condition, with no evidence remaining of the previous night's elaborate celebration.
In the kitchen, he discovered Maria sitting at their usual table with a cup of coffee and a notepad, reviewing what appeared to be a detailed analysis of the gala's success and areas for improvement. "Good morning," he said, noting how different everything felt now that they had acknowledged their feelings for each other. Maria looked up with a smile that seemed both shy and confident.
"Good morning.
I was just finishing my event summary while everything was still fresh in my mind." Alexander poured himself coffee and sat across from her, feeling the weight of everything they needed to discuss.
"How are you feeling this morning? About everything that happened last night?" "Which part?" Maria asked with a slight tease in her voice. "The successful fundraising event, or the conversation we had afterward?"
"Both, I suppose." Maria set down her pen and looked at him directly.
"I feel good about both.
The event exceeded our expectations, and, as for our conversation..." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I feel hopeful, and nervous, and excited, and terrified all at the same time."
"That's exactly how I feel," Alexander admitted.
"Along with completely uncertain about how to navigate this situation properly."
"What makes you think there's a proper way to navigate it?" Maria asked. "Maybe we just have to figure it out as we go along." Before Alexander could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested she had news to share.
"Good morning, Mr. Sterling, Maria," she said warmly. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but your mother called and asked me to let you know she'll be stopping by this afternoon to discuss the gala results."
Alexander felt a slight sense of dread.
His mother had clearly noticed the dynamic between him and Maria the previous evening, and Margaret Sterling was not one to ignore such observations.
"Did she say what time?" Alexander asked.
"Around 2 o'clock, Mrs. Chen replied. She also asked me to make sure Maria would be available for the conversation."
After Mrs. Chen left, Maria looked at Alexander with raised eyebrows. "That sounds ominous."
"My mother is very perceptive," Alexander explained.
"She noticed something between us last night, and she's not going to ignore it." "What do you think she'll say?" Alexander considered the question carefully. "I honestly don't know.
My mother has always been supportive of my decisions, but this situation is unprecedented."
"Because I'm an employee?" "Because you're someone I care about," Alexander corrected. "My mother's concern will be whether this relationship is good for both of us, not what other people might think about it."
Maria seemed reassured by this answer, but Alexander could see that she was still nervous about the upcoming conversation. He reached across the table and took her hand, noting how natural the gesture felt despite its newness. "Whatever my mother says," he told her, "it doesn't change how I feel about you or what I want for our future."
"What do you want for our future?" Maria asked quietly.
It was a question Alexander had been pondering since their kiss the night before, and he realized that his answer would require him to reconsider everything he had previously believed about his life plan. "I want to explore this relationship and see where it leads us," he said honestly. "I want to support your career goals and help you achieve whatever you dream of achieving. And I want to find out what kind of life we can build together."
Even if that means dealing with people who think we're not suited for each other? Especially then, Alexander replied firmly.
I've spent my entire adult life making decisions based on other people's expectations and social conventions. For once, I want to make a decision based purely on what feels right to me. Their conversation was interrupted by David arriving with the morning's business correspondence, but Alexander found it difficult to concentrate on financial reports and meeting schedules when all he really wanted was to continue talking with Maria about their future. After David left, Maria brought up the subject that Alexander had been dreading. I should probably call Senator Williams about the job opportunity, she said. It would be rude not to acknowledge her offer. Alexander felt his protective instincts rise, along with a selfish desire to discourage Maria from pursuing an opportunity that might take her away from him. But he forced himself to respond as the supportive partner he wanted to be. You should definitely call her, he said, trying to keep his voice neutral.